This presentation is intended to provide an introduction to the scope and intention of the Food Modernization, Safety Modernization Act. The Act introduced changes to the Food and Drug and Cosmetics Acts and required the FDA to produce new regulations. FSMA is a large piece of legislation that takes time to be understood. It can also be expected to evolve and adapt as the stakeholders and the regulator gain experience with its implementation. The Act was signed into law by President Obama on January the 4th, 2011. It directs and enables the FDA to focus on prevention of food safety issues rather than relying primarily on reaction, either after something's happened or as a result of inspection activity. The law provides the FDA with additional tools and powers and also responsibilities to support and direct the industry in the development of preventive systems, and also powers to contain and detain food when it becomes unsafe and a threat to public health. An additional mandate in the new requirements and the regulations is to ensure that imported food meets the same level of food safety and complies with food safety regulations. There is a public health imperative that says that food safety or food illness is a preventable occurrence. In the United States, 1 in 6 people may suffer a foodborne illness every year, which estimates would suggest 48 million people get sick. 128,000, 130,000 may be hospitalized, and up to 3,000 people may die. In addition to prevention of foodborne illness can result in substantial benefits. First, in preventing people from becoming sick or dying, and also in terms of reduced medical costs, maintaining productivity, and avoidance of costly disruptions of the food system caused by illness and outbreaks and recalls. So this is the first major overhaul of the food safety regulations in 73 years. So that makes it an extremely large deal for everybody, and it has been quite comprehensive. It's been a long time since there's been such a comprehensive change. So there are many contributing factors which drive the creation of this particular legislation and the new regulation. The globalization of the food supply, and think of Asian shrimp, frozen Chinese vegetables, Chilean grapes, New Zealand lamb, Indian spices, Italian olive oil, or fresh cucumbers from Holland that might be found in North American dinner plates. Supply chains are sometimes extremely complicated and can shift based on currency, prices, weather conditions, and harvest yields. Estimates suggest that 15% of the U.S. food supply is imported. Estimates indicate that there are some 300,000 foreign enterprises that produce and export foods into the U.S. market. Some few countries contribute key food groups, for instance seafood and perishables such as fruit and vegetables. We have emerging hazards, E. coli 0104H4 strains, avian influenza, swine flu, and the detection of salmonella in perhaps unusual places or places we didn't expect, nuts, teas, all speak to a changing and dynamic food safety environment. We have an aging population and an increase in vulnerable groups in our population whose immune systems are not as robust. We're much better equipped to detect and identify unsafe food and track it to the source. Consumer expectations are high. The speed with which information and disinformation spreads and can garner attention is quite dizzying. One tweet has the potential to be catastrophic for a food manufacturer. And not least, a steady stream of incidents of preventable recalls. Taking these factors together, the FSMA regulation was to fulfill a mandate to protect public health and develop a comprehensive strategy that would address food safety. This list is just some of the recalls that happened over 2 months in 2015. And if you follow the food safety news, the Peanut Corporation of America incident from 2008 is perhaps finally drawing to its conclusion. There was a news report yesterday that the headquarters was taken over by the bank. But that particular incident affected at least 200 other food companies. Illnesses were distributed over 46 states, and approximately 3,900 other products had to be recalled from the marketplace. And farm cantaloupes resulted in 30 deaths, sickened 147 people, and one of the deadliest foodborne illnesses outbreaks in U.S. history. And other incidences such as mung bean sprouts, salmonella in cucumbers, and listeria in caramel apples adds to a list of, that's different when it comes to potential food safety issues. Risk-based, the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for human food. There's one for food for animals. There are standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. There is something in the rules which talks about accrediting third-party auditors, and we'll talk a little about that, but that rule has been finalized. And for imported food, again, up to 15% of the food supply, the Foreign Supply Verification Program, which requires importers to meet the same standards that are expected domestically. The transportation, a sector of the food chain that hasn't seen much attention, so for the sanitary transportation of human and animal food, which codifies really what a well-organized and safe food transporter would already have in place, but puts it into regulation. Another concern has been the intentional adulteration of food, both from a potentially intent to do harm, but also economically motivated. So in this case, this particular rule deals with those who intend to cause harm, and basically it directs facilities to have a food defense plan. Other rules that don't get quite as much attention. So if an organization wants to be accredited to conduct regulatory audits, it will have to pay a fee. So there's a rule for that. Facilities who are registered with the FDA, they've made some amendments to that. Those are in the proposal stage. There's a requirement now that records be made available, and so that rule has been finalized, records and documents. When we're importing, there has to be information provided prior to it arriving at port, and because of the expanded powers of the FDA, they're now able to put things under what they call administrative detention, and the final rule for the criteria for that has been published. So that just gives you a sense of some of the rules that are in progress or are in place.
We're getting it done.
Other things that have been published to help the industry, and that's one of the mandates that the FDA has been given, is to support the industry in achieving safer food. So they've produced to date some guidance documents, and they'll expected to be producing others. Auditor accreditation certification is important because for certain foods coming into being imported, there'll be a requirement that they have had an unannounced audit by a qualified auditor. So they're interested in the draft guidance for industry and for the FDA staff. Other guidance for the industries are information on the various topics that are listed, and we're also expecting to see other guidance documents, for instance, commodity sector-specific guidance, produce safety, we're already seeing that in the produce regulation, guidance documents around food defense, and further guidance documents on preventive controls. FDA's actually a fairly busy place. Some of the other activities that have been going on, some of the other directions in FSMA has directed them to establish a program for the testing of food by accredited laboratories and establish a publicly available registry of accreditation bodies recognized by the Secretary and Laboratories Establishment. In other words, food testing that's going to be used to verify or validate the safety of food is going to be required to be done by a certified laboratory. And so they're moving to develop a list and the rules around what will be accepted for accreditation. The FDA is mandated to create a list of high-risk foods. It's published a document on its approach to doing this. but so far the list has not been published. The FDA is also directed to identify high-risk facilities and in fact to develop a process for being able to track food, especially from high-risk facilities, through the system more efficiently. FDA is being directed to increase its capacity by involving local and state food safety departments and inspection departments. And it also has a directive to build capacity in countries that export into the U.S. Now, some highly developed countries perhaps don't need that kind of assistance, but there are other countries in which the technical, scientific, and regulatory food safety capacity can use the assistance of the FDA. The FDA, in cooperation with other entities, has been creating training, and they have, in association with the FSPCA, created training for the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual for human food. They've just launched the training for animal food. I believe the first session of that is coming up, and they will continue to work with stakeholders to develop the qualifications for competency and training in various other aspects of food safety. In terms of industry assistance, there are two technical assistance networks. The first one, FDA FSMA TAN, is designed to assist facilities with information on the regulations and the application of regulations. The second one, from the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, the FSPCA, assists with the technical application of preventive controls. For both of these, you can go to the links that are on the slides, and you can, provided you leave your email address and do a little registration, you can leave a question for the regulator or for the FSPCA, and you're expected to get a response. Who's covered? Any facility that's currently required to register with the FDA every 2 years, or biannually as it says in the regulation, is probably going to need to comply with this regulation. There may be exceptions, but if you fall into that category, it's likely going to affect you. So those are facilities that manufacture, process, pack, and hold food. So it applies to distributors. It's not intended, the human rule is not intended to include farms or retail food establishments directly. However, retail food establishments are potentially affected indirectly as part of the preventive control rules and the food safety plan that's required from facilities that are covered. These are the key FSMA themes and concepts, and I'm just going to quote to get a sense of the direction here. So in the words of the FDA, FSMA is based on the widely shared understanding that the foundation for reducing the risk of preventable foodborne illness in today's global food system and providing consumers the assurances of food safety they seek is action by the food industry. Specifically, food safety depends primarily on the food industry, with top-level management commitment and working in a continuous improvement mode to implement science and risk-based preventive measures at all appropriate points across the farm-to-table spectrum, and secondly, manage their operations and supply chains in a manner that provides documented assurances that appropriate preventive measures are being implemented as a matter of routine practice every day. FSMA is grounded in this understanding of how food safety can be protected in today's global food system. So the law clarifies that people and businesses that provide food to the public, whether they produce, process, transport, or sell food, are responsible for taking the steps necessary to ensure that they've identified and controlled hazards that would make food safe. It's not the regulator's responsibility. It's not the public's responsibility. It's the producer's responsibility to take that into account. For those who are currently GFSI, have a GFSI scheme certification, then you're probably well along the path to being in compliance. Although there are some things that need to be understood at how you might present your food safety plan to the regulator in order to demonstrate that you're in compliance with the regulations. So the first step, prevention, is based on the development of a food safety plan, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls. And the FDA has published the rules that direct that in most of the sectors that they're required to do so. The next pillar is the inspection, compliance, and response. And the regulation sets frequencies for high-risk and lower-risk suppliers, the frequency in which they're expected to be inspected. And it has enhanced the FDA's capabilities in reacting to out-of-compliance situations and given it powers to detain food if necessary, and also to recall it from the marketplace should it be deemed to be unsafe. Again, with the imported food, because it is such an important segment and can have a significant impact, it has to meet the same standards, with the onus being on the importer. The law also provides a mandate for the FDA to work closely with government partners, so at the federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal level. FDA's goal is to establish an integrated and nationwide food safety system, harmonized inspections, requirements, surveillance methods, and training. And we'll come and we'll describe some of these things, take a slightly deeper dive. So let's just look first at preventive control programs. So risk-based hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. So the rule requires that a facility develop a mandatory written food safety plan that has been developed by a preventive controls qualified individual. That food safety plan will be based on hazard analysis and the development where required of risk-based preventive controls. So for those who are saying, well, is that the same as HACCP? It's the same but different. But the same process. And in fact, in the preventive controls qualified individual training, the methodology is very similar, and we'll come to some of the differences in a little while. Among the hazards that have to be considered as part of that hazard analysis are intentional adulteration that's economically motivated. It only becomes of concern when it could cause harm to human health. So grinding peanut butter and diluting cumin powder with it or peanut, I should say, shells, and diluting that into cumin seed is definitely potentially a human health issue, as well as economically motivated adulteration. Another hazard that is listed as having to be considered are radiological hazards, although they now are not separated. They come under chemical hazards, or I think it's chemical hazards, but they're specifically called out in the regulation. And these regulations are extended to down the supply chain. So they're all preventive control based or prevention based. So prevention in produce, transport, and then expanded to animal feed and to importers. This provides a graphic of what the food safety plan development and ongoing management would look like. If we were in a HACCP facility, we'd see a number of preliminary steps to the development of your HACCP plan. Those are not regulated as required, but they're highly suggested that they be done, such as the development of the HACCP team, the process flow diagram, all those preliminary activities that you do. The FDA in their Preventive Controls Qualified Individual Training has provided some model forms that could be used and some model plans to illustrate the development of preventive control plans. A hazard analysis, evaluation of the hazards, and development of preventive controls, which is the new term that we need to understand and get used to. Once the food safety plan has been developed, then we have to monitor it, not just the CCPs, but monitor all the preventive controls, and where we find they're out of control, you need to take corrective action which is documented, designed to prevent reoccurrence of the failure of the preventive control plan, and we have to carry out verification activities. Verification in this case would include validation that the plan continues to be effective. For the HACCP people among the attendees, validation of preventive controls is expected for process preventive controls, and it's expected it's only mandated in one other preventive control, but it's highly recommended. At certain frequencies, a reanalysis of the plan is expected. If you're GFSI certified, have a HACCP plan, that may be expected to be at least once a year, or when something triggers the requirement for reanalysis. The regulation suggests that it's required at once every 3 years, or when it might be required if you have a failure of the preventive control plan, if you have a recall, if the science changes, if you change your facility, the equipment, the layout, the products, introduce an allergen, then obviously either a new plan or reanalysis would be required. So there are both similarities and some slight differences between what a HACCP certified facility might currently be like. Within that, maintaining of documentation and records is going to be a requirement. So Section 103, hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, directs that you have to evaluate hazards that could affect food safety, identify and implement preventive controls to prevent reasonably foreseeable hazards, monitor controls and maintain monitoring records, and conduct verification activities. For many of your facilities, this is not really a new activity. What's new is understanding the differences between what you do now and what the expectation of this regulation might be. In the regulation, preventative controls come in various flavors. One of which is process preventive controls, which would be very similar to CCPs under the current regulation. Food allergen preventive controls and sanitation preventive controls might be required in certain instances. So process controls we could recognize as CCPs. Food allergen controls might be an allergen management program, which is labeling, label checks, perhaps the design of labels. All those maybe end up as preventive controls in certain plans. It will vary from place to place. Mandated in the regulation is a recall plan. The current good manufacturing practices is also still remains part of the legislation. Supply preventive control programs has been introduced and will be of particular interest to everybody. That's definitely a slightly different take on supplier management programs. There's a requirement for training programs, and where they're producing high-risk foods, environmental controls and monitoring is a requirement. The current good manufacturing practices previously found at 21 CFR Part 1 110 are now in CFR 117 Subpart D, are updated, but generally no really, I think, significant changes to the requirements of the good manufacturing practices. The ones that have asterisks have the potential in certain operations to become preventive controls. So in some cases, depending on the outcome of your hazard analysis, you may end up with a preventive control in these areas. So one of the rules is the produce safety standards, and so that sets some requirements for the produce industry, and there's 6 elements to this particular new rule. So if you're in the business of growing produce, there's rules about water, and basically requires the testing of water for generic E. coli and sets standards For hand washing and food contact services, any direct contact of water post-harvest, including ice, has to have zero presence of generic E. coli, which you might expect. However, in the irrigation world, water is not always perfectly free from the presence of the sources that create generic E. coli, and so they have set standards that have to be achieved for irrigation water, which are based on sampling plans and taking averages and looking at the variation over time and establishing limits based on individual water supplies, sampling levels based on the source of water, whether it's surface water, untreated surface water, or groundwater, and in some cases even using treated municipal water, in which case water testing would be minimalized. Biological soil amendments used as fertilizers, so most often manure, is often applied to crops, and however, science and studies determine that over time the pathogens disperse and don't necessarily affect the crop, so it's generally based on the time between the application of the amendments and the harvest for those who are using those. There have been, between 1996 and 2014, 43 outbreaks due to sprouts. So sprouts get some special mention, special attention in the regulation, including the direction to treat the seeds, although it's not specified. Things that good agricultural practices of produce suggest is that you want to be aware of any contamination from animals that get into the growing area, both domestic and wild, and do your best to control those. Workers who are involved in the harvest and cleaning, packing, and shipping of produce need to behave and be hygienic, so worker training and hygiene to protect the food. The equipment and tools that are used need to be in good condition. We don't like wood splinters in our apples or pieces of plastic or contamination from dirty harvest equipment, breaking of knives, bits of metal, those things, wires in our food. So looking out for those potential harboring points, making sure that the equipment is food grade and maintained in a sanitary condition becomes important, and so that's specifically laid out in the regulation. Agriculture is a complicated enterprise, as is much of the food industry. So there are some produce which are rarely consumed raw. So that's among a list of exemptions. Asparagus, beans, garden beets, cashews, sour cherries are among many which are not really consumed raw and so are exempt from the rule. Grains are exempt from the rule, and some very small facilities may be exempt from the produce rule. So import safety, the paradigm shift has moved to importer accountability. So the importers are responsible for verifying that the food that they bring in and import to the into the U.S. Follows the same rules, and that hazard analysis has been done, and that preventive controls are in place. So very quickly, the foreign importer verification program directs that an importer or a consignee, someone who the food is being consigned to and agrees to act as the importer, must have a program, a foreign supply verification program, a documented program. That program asks them to analyze what hazards that particular food may have in it and determine whether the supplier has controlled the hazards or not. Now, there may be instances where that hazard is controlled downstream, in which case the importer must then receive written assurances from the consignee of the food, the person who's receiving it, that they have controls in place to control that hazard. But the basic is that they have to determine that their foreign suppliers have food safety programs in place and monitor and conduct verification activities. So verification activities might include their suppliers having a accredited certified food safety audit. The default position, especially for high-risk foods, being annually, but the foreign supplier verification programs allows the importer to determine the risks and perhaps reduce the frequency of audit if they deem that through their analysis to be suitable. There's a fair amount of flexibility in the foreign supplier verification program, but the importer becomes responsible for maintaining the safety of imported food, or determining that it is safe, even if the supplier is the person who's responsible. So they have to have a program, they have to conduct a hazard analysis, and then determine what supplier verification activities are appropriate. They're required to take corrective actions if needed, and then undergo periodic reassessment. And they have to maintain records of that. The FDA can ask for those records at any time, and the importer is obliged to supply them. The importer themselves do not necessarily have to carry out the verification activities. In other words, go audit a facility on its own, but it may do so if it decides that that's what's important. And then we have a requirement to maintain records, which are should be available to the FDA on demand. The Voluntary Qualified Importer Program is one where you can, if you wish to, submit additional information and become registered. It's supposed to expedite at the import stage, at the port, transition through the port, if you are on the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. The eligibility requirements to be on that, you have to have at least 3 years history of importing without a history of any incidences. None of the food that you import, even if it's not from a supplier that's on the VQA, can have any issues, and you have to demonstrate that you're in compliance with everything. You need a DUNS, a special registration number, and you have to be in good standing, and you have to pay the fee. Another which we talked about briefly, feature of is the enhanced partnerships. It's vital to the success of the plan, especially for inspections that might be happening in other countries. So those auditors may be, in fact, the food inspectors from the other countries. That's someone who can become qualified. So the FDA cannot inspect everywhere. It may be stretched to conduct inspections within the North American continent, even within the U.S. That's why the partnerships with the state inspection agencies is going to be important. Being able to make certain countries where they need some help more capable, and improving their capability to manage safe food may be important to the success. So it becomes an important part of the criteria. Within the regulation, there are definitions of regular business, if you like, small and very small business. These affect implementation dates. A small business is generally one which has less than 500 employees. That's a business-wide, so it's across all enterprises, all facilities, all different sites. And a very small business, generally established through revenue limits, and this lists them here. So if you may be in that category, it may affect how soon you have to be in compliance with the regulation. The compliance schedules are listed here, so you can see the preventive controls for human food. If you're a regular business, you need to be in compliance in September of 2016. If you're a small business, you have another year. If you're a very small business, you have another 2 years from this September, or 3 years from last September, to be in compliance. So there's also, in terms of immediate reaction, so if a facility during an inspection is informed and takes immediate corrective action, that's one way that they have power, or they can ask you to respond. There's also a sort of administrative response where they write you a letter and ask you to correct certain things within a certain period of time. So that's another part of their armory, something that they do now. But they're allowed to detain product if they suspect it's unsafe. If there's serious issues, they can suspend the registration. They're also mandated with enhancing the capability to trace and figure out a system for tracing high-risk foods. There are thousands of pages in the various rules, especially if you look at the Federal Register and look at all the responses to the questions and suggestions and the FDA response. So how would one approach getting ready? So obviously there's webinars and there's going to be training. To get an understanding, the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual Training, which is, there's some 400, I think, registered lead trainers now, and courses are going on around the country, is one way to get to understand what the FDA feels, understands, and is going to expect from a food safety plan and preventive controls. However, it's not necessarily a requirement to become qualified. You can become qualified through experience and training in other ways, provided you can demonstrate to an FDA inspector through your preventive control plan and through your interactions with them that you're qualified. They're going to look at outcome, at least that's what they say. Many people are going to training so they don't have any arguments about the training, but it is one way to understand what the regulation is looking for in the way of preventive controls, but it is also similar to HACCP. There are, as I said, many sources of information and much good bedtime reading, and many guidance documents and new guidance documents to come, and the whole thing's going to evolve over time.